Welcome to another video discussion on Encountering Jesus Now. On this video, I will be acting as our guide in our discussion as we wrestle with this whole matter of what God is like. In one of the other videos in the library, we examined whether it was even reasonable to believe that God exists. The title of that video was The Case for God. On that video, we discussed whether there is reasonable evidence available for us to see that would enable us to conclude that God does exist. On this video, I am going to make the following assumption. My assumption is this, that you have either decided that God exists, or you are at least considering that is a possibility. If this assumption does not apply to you, then to spend much time with the topic that we will be discussing on this video may not be of much interest or value to you. You are welcome to continue to view this discussion, but I would encourage you to spend most of your time continuing to consider the reliable evidence you can observe that makes many conclude that there must be a God. With that, let me begin our discussion today by asking you these questions. Since you do believe there is a God, what is your God like? Is your God one of many? Is your God a God that merely watches over his creation but does not directly get involved with it? Is your God's major focus on humans and keeping track of whether their good actions outweigh their bad ones? Oh, by the way, how do we find out what God is like? Let's look at some of these questions. Let's start by looking at this question. Is there only one supreme God, or are there multiple deities? Of all the people who believe in some sort of God and are therefore involved in some sort of religion, about 93% are involved in one of 5 religions. Those religions are Hinduism, Buddhism, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. The other 7% are involved in some offshoot of one of these religions, or else some regional folk religion. Approximately 23% of the people who believe in God believe there are multiple gods. The other 77% of religious people believe in one God. The astonishing thing is that of all of those who believe in one God, all use the same sacred text as their guide to answer questions about the God they believe in. That sacred text is what is known today as the Old Testament of the Bible. The other 2 major religions, Hinduism and Buddhism, do believe in multiple gods. They do have texts that they consider as sacred, yet none of these texts deal much with revealing who the gods are, and none of these texts deal with what these gods are like. Since there is not a primary source for an examination, we are not going to research their views of gods and their respective religions. However, I will make this one observation. Many of the gods these 2 religious orders believe in are connected to the physical elements of creation. For example, some of the things that they consider to be gods are a sun god, or a god of rain, or a fertility god. Each god is worshipped as the God who controls that particular aspect of creation. Let me offer a couple of statements of logic that might help us in our quest to decide whether there is one God or many. The first statement of logic goes like this. If there were more than one God, the universe would likely be in disorder because of the multiple independent authorities and creative entities that at some point would have a different view or a different plan or different ideas of what was best to do. The second statement of logic is this: since God is a completely perfect being, there cannot be a second God. For if there were, they would have to differ in some way, and to differ from complete perfection is to be less than perfect. So that being would not be a God in the sense of our definition of God. These two statements do not prove anything, but they do create intellectual areas of concern if we come to believe in multiple gods. Let's now examine the evidence of those who believe in one God. As I stated earlier, 3/4 of the people who believe there is a God also believe there is one God. Nearly all of them use the texts that have been compiled in what we now know as the Old Testament of the Bible. We can get a good idea of who their God is by doing a thorough examination and investigation of what they consider to be their sacred texts. This investigation would involve evaluating the text to see whether there is evidence to support its reliability. Then, if that proves to be strong enough to support the placing of our trust and faith in what it says, there would need to be a study of its contents to see what it has to say about who God is, the God of this Bible. This is even more important because these sacred texts claim to be from God. If you are wanting to examine reasons for believing that the Old Testament of the Bible is a reliable source that you can trust to be true, I have produced a separate video that will provide historical and archaeological evidence of its reliability. But for the purpose of this video, I want to move forward and examine what the Old Testament says God is like. Since the Old Testament begins with the book that is penned by a man named Moses, and the things that he is writing about are not things he himself witnessed, but instead, according to the text of the Bible, he is acting as a scribe of God himself. We need to look at what he has to say because it is in effect talking about what God says. So as we begin reading this first book that Moses has written, Genesis, we quickly see that God claims to be the God of creation. The very first words of this scroll are, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth." The next part of this text then describes the unfolding of this huge creative act, climaxing with the creation of man and woman. Then, the major focus of the narrative shifts from a creative God to a God who wants and enjoys fellowship and relationship with these humans he has created. He would demonstrate this by accompanying them as they walked through the beautiful environment he had created for them to live in. So we learn that the God of the Old Testament is a creator God. But we also learn that the God of the Old Testament has a deep desire for relationship with those beings that he has created. As we continue this narrative, we learn that man and woman dishonored God by disregarding his request for how to behave and live. This puts a major block in this relationship between man and God. These acts of disregard and disobedience are called sins against God. When these human beings made the choice to commit these sins and then tried to hide them, a huge chasm continues to develop in the relationship between man and God. What is revealing about this is as we seek to understand what we can about God, we find that in spite of being dishonored by man and woman, as they chose to follow their own will, we find God does not abandon them, toss them aside, or even destroy them. Instead, he provides basic needs for them and looks after them. As the narrative goes on, these first creative beings begin to populate the world that God has created. Less and less of these people pay any attention to God's ways. The desires of man became more and more self-willed, and thus more sinful, which caused them to be more and more distant from God and his ways. In fact, man no longer even acts as if God is a reality. This brings God to the place where he even regrets creating humans. Yet he does not give up on them. So he searches for just one person who is striving to respect God and his ways. When he finds that person, he provides a way to spare the human race, even though he brings judgment on all those who are not striving to please or honor him. God then starts a rebuilding process where he works to build a nation of people who would choose to honor him and his ways. They would have to choose to separate themselves from the usual ways and the various allurements of the world and live with a different worldview. If they would do that, he would bless them. The rest of the Old Testament is about the saga of working with people to build this nation of God honoring people. It is filled with the history of those people, the praise of those people as they experience this God, and the wisdom God reveals to them. It is also further words directly from God that are sometimes warnings and other times reminders of his promises that he makes to his people. And then there are those words of prophecy that God makes about future things that he will bring about. As you go through the pages of the text and realize the centuries of time they represent, you can see that God's focus and goals remain the same. He is striving to build a nation of people who would choose to live that different worldview and choose to live to honor him. To do that, through the centuries of time, God has continued to reveal more and more of himself. He is also striving to restore the intimate relationship between himself and man and woman. To do that, he has provided a way to deal with sins that have been committed. He provides a way for those sins to be forgiven so that both men and women can once again experience the intimacy and the closeness that they once were able to have with him. Along the way, he continues to lavish his love, concern, and care for them. Often, he does that through some spectacular event, and then that occasion is marked with a new name that God would be called. This saga of human history is interwoven with the involvement of God with his people. This is both fascinating and revealing, and I want to encourage you to take time to examine the contents of the text that we have been speaking of. Take time to read the first two books of the Old Testament of the Bible, Genesis and Exodus. If you have time, then continue to read further. Read Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Samuel, as well as the Psalms and Proverbs. Then read the text of Isaiah and Jeremiah, two of the prophets that God used. As you continue to read, Look and continue to verify the general summary that I have offered to you. See if it is accurate. All of these texts give a glimpse at the history of God working in real time with a people to build a nation, the nation of God. This nation will eventually be referred to as the kingdom of God. This kingdom of God would one day have a king that would rule forever. Oh, I'm getting a little ahead of my presentation for today, but you can read on and see for yourself. Let's stop here so that you can do that investigation. On the next video, What is God Like Part 2, we will pick up with the examination of who God is. And we will do that by looking at the various names of God, which all reveal a little bit more of the God of the Old Testament text, and who He is and what He is like. Until that next time, continue to read and search and continue to see what you can see about this God and what He is like.